Rain lashed the Riverside County Courthouse, drumming steel awnings into a roar that drowned the wail of a distant siren. Inside Courtroom 7, fluorescent lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across oak panels dulled by decades of sweat and verdict. A bailiff's boots scuffed the worn floor as he lunged, pinning David Keene's trembling arms to the arms of his military-grade wheelchair. Metal cuffs snapped shut, their clank sharper than the gavel lying silent on Judge Elena Brooks's bench. David, 34, his face carved with lines from war, jerked against the restraints. His prosthetic right leg, hidden under pressed khaki pants, shifted awkwardly, the socket pinching skin scarred from an IED blast. His left hand spasmed, fingers curling inward, as he locked eyes with the bailiff, whose jaw twitched but held firm. The crowd, reporters, veterans, clerks, pressed closer to the railing, camera phones flashing like strobe lights in the dim room. Rain battered the tall windows, streaking glass with rivers that blurred the neon glow of news vans outside. Judge Brooks, 58, her black robe stark against the faded American flag, stood rigid at the bench. Her silver hair caught the flickering light as she raised a hand, silencing the murmurs rippling through the gallery. "Order," she said, her voice like a blade slicing the humid air. "Sergeant Keene, you will stand for this court's judgment, or you will answer for contempt." The bailiff stepped back, his boots squeaking on the polished floor. David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheelchair's arms, his shoulders hunching under a plain white button-up shirt. Sweat beaded his forehead, glinting under the harsh lights. The crowd leaned forward, a collective breath held, as David's good leg tensed, pushing against the footrest. His prosthetic creaked, the sound swallowed by the rain's relentless pounding. Marcus Washington, 29, David's attorney, leapt to his feet, his cheap suit jacket flapping. "Your Honor, my client is physically unable to comply. His medical—" "Enough, Mr. Washington," Brooks cut in, her eyes narrowing over wire-rimmed glasses. "This court does not bend for excuses. The defendant will stand." A low groan escaped David's lips as he pressed upward, his arms trembling under the strain. The wheelchair rocked slightly, its wheels squeaking against the floor. His scarred face contorted, jaw clenched, as he rose inch by inch. The crowd's murmurs grew. A reporter scribbled furiously. A veteran in a faded cap shook his head. A woman in a postal uniform gripped the railing. Camera flashes popped, each burst glinting off the cuffs still dangling from David's wrists. For a moment he stood, swaying, his good leg quivering, his prosthetic barely supporting the weight. His chest heaved, breath ragged as he faced Brooks. The judge's lips pursed, her fingers tightening around a stack of papers. Then it came, a tremor, sharp and unstoppable, rippling from David's damaged leg upward. His eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing his face, and his knees buckled. He fell hard. His shoulder slammed the defense table's edge, splintering wood with a crack that echoed like gunfire. He hit the floor, cuffs clanging against tile, his wheelchair tipping sideways with a screech. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Marcus dropped to his knees, hands hovering over David's sprawled form. "Your Honor, please!" David's fingers clawed the floor, nails scraping as he dragged himself toward the table's leg. His breath came in sharp bursts, misting the cold tile. The crowd surged forward, a reporter's pen skittering across the floor, a phone tumbling from a spectator's hand. Rain roared louder, as if the storm itself protested. Brooks slammed her gavel once, twice, its thuds lost in the chaos. "Order! I will have order!" David's hand found the table's edge. His arm shook as he pulled, his prosthetic leg dragging uselessly. Marcus gripped his shoulder, trying to steady him, but David waved him off with a grunt. His eyes locked on Brooks, unyielding as he rasped, "I'm trying, Your Honor." The gallery froze. A Korean War veteran, his cap embroidered with 38th Infantry, rose from his seat, his cane tapping the floor. "I'll stand for him," he said, his voice cracking like dry wood. Beside him, the postal worker stood, her name tag glinting under the lights.
My son served.
I'll stand too. One by one, the crowd rose, reporters, clerks, a stenographer setting aside her machine. Their shoes scuffed, chairs creaked, and the air thickened with the weight of their defiance. Camera flashes slowed, then stopped, as phones lowered. The bailiff shifted, his hand hovering near his belt, but he didn't move. Brooks' face tightened, her gavel still raised. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering faster, casting her shadow long and jagged across the bench. David, still on the floor, propped himself against the table, his chest heaving. His cuffs glinted as he raised a trembling hand, pointing to the crowd. "They're standing for me," he said, his voice low but steady. The courtroom doors burst open. A tall woman in an army dress uniform strode in, her boots clicking with precision. Her insignia gleamed, Colonel Jennifer Ramirez, Judge Advocate General's Corps. She carried a sealed envelope, its red wax stamp catching the light. The crowd parted, heads turning as she approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the rain's roar, "this proceeding is under federal review." Brooks's gavel froze midair. The envelope hit the bench with a soft thud, its wax seal cracking. Outside, lightning split the sky, and the crowd's murmurs rose to a roar. Thunder rattled the windows of Courtroom 7, the glass panes trembling as rain lashed in diagonal sheets. Inside, Colonel Jennifer Ramirez stood motionless before Judge Elena Brooks' bench, her army dress uniform pristine despite the storm's chaos outside. The red wax-sealed envelope lay cracked open, its contents, a single sheet of embossed paper, clutched in Brooks's hand. Her fingers, usually steady, twitched as she scanned the text, the fluorescent lights above buzzing erratically, casting her face in stark relief. David Keene, 34, slumped against the defense table's splintered edge, his wheelchair righted but cuffed wrists still glinting under the flickering glow. His scarred face glistened with sweat, his khaki pants streaked with floor dust. His prosthetic leg jutted at an angle, the socket loosened from his fall. His chest heaved, each breath a shallow rasp, as his attorney, Marcus Washington, knelt beside him, loosening the cuffs with a key borrowed from the bailiff. The metal clanked free, falling to the tile with a dull ring. The gallery stood rigid, reporters, veterans, clerks, eyes darting between Ramirez and Brooks. The Korean War veteran, his cane gripped tightly, leaned forward, his cap's embroidery catching a stray beam of light. The postal worker beside him clutched her name tag, her knuckles pale. Camera phones, momentarily stilled, began flashing again, their bursts punctuating the rain's roar. A reporter's notebook slid to the floor, pages splaying across the tile. Brooks lowered the document, her lips a thin line. "Colonel Ramirez," she said, her voice taut but measured, "this court does not tolerate interruptions. Explain your presence, or I will have you removed." Ramirez's boots clicked as she stepped closer, her posture unyielding. "Your Honor, this federal order grants observer status from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Complaints regarding disabled veterans' treatment in this jurisdiction prompted my assignment." She gestured toward David, her insignia glinting. "What I witnessed upon entry, restraining a disabled defendant for failing to stand, raises serious concerns." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The bailiff, stationed near the door, shifted his weight, his hand brushing his radio. Marcus stood, his suit jacket rumpled, and raised a hand. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate recess. My client requires medical attention." David shook his head, gripping the table's edge to pull himself upright in his wheelchair. His voice, hoarse but firm, cut through the noise. "I can speak for myself." He adjusted his shirt, the fabric clinging to his sweat-soaked shoulders, and faced Brooks. "This isn't about me standing.
It's about a courthouse I can't even reach without crawling 8 blocks through rain. The crowd stirred.
A reporter whispered into a recorder, her words lost in the storm's howl. The stenographer's fingers hovered over her machine, then resumed typing, the clatter sharp against the thunder. Brooke's eyes narrowed, her gavel rising as if to strike, but she paused, her gaze flicking to the federal order.
The paper trembled slightly in her hand. "Mr. Keene," she said, "this court operates on protocol, not personal convenience."
Your failure to appear at prior hearings constitutes contempt, regardless of your stated challenges. David's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his scarred cheek. His fingers, still trembling from nerve damage, curled around a worn leather cord at his neck, pulling a purple heart medal from beneath his shirt. The medal swung gently, catching the light. I serve to protect rights, Your Honor. Equal access is one of them. The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a veteran's cane tapping in approval. The Korean War veteran shouted, "Damn right!" before the bailiff barked, "Quiet!" Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in a brief, blinding pulse. Ramirez raised a hand, silencing the crowd without a word. Your Honor, the Americans with Disabilities Act mandates reasonable accommodations. This courthouse's failure to comply is documented. She produced a photograph from her briefcase, sliding it across the bench. The image showed David at a bus stop 8 blocks away, his wheelchair mired in a cracked sidewalk, rain soaking his clothes. His head was bowed, hands gripping the wheels, as a blurred crowd passed by, umbrellas tilted against the storm. Brooks stared at the photo, her gavel lowering to the bench with a soft clunk. The room fell silent, save for the rain's relentless drumming. Marcus seized the moment, stepping forward. Your Honor, the court's own scheduling errors and inaccessible facilities caused my client's absences. Punishing him for systemic failures is unjust. Brooks's eyes flicked from the photo to David, then to the standing crowd. Her fingers brushed the gavel, hesitating. The fluorescent lights flickered again, plunging the room into a half-second of darkness before buzzing back to life. A reporter's pen scratched furiously, ink smearing as her hand shook. "Colonel," Brooks said, her voice lower now, "your observer status does not grant you authority to dictate proceedings. However," she paused, glancing at the federal order again, "this court will recess for 15 minutes to review this documentation." The gavel struck, its cracks swallowed by a thunderclap. Brooks swept from the bench, her robe billowing as she disappeared into her chambers, the federal order and photograph clutched in her hand. Ramirez followed, her boots echoing in the sudden hush. The courtroom doors slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the oak-paneled walls. The crowd exhaled, chairs creaking as some sat, others remaining upright. Marcus knelt beside David, checking his prosthetics socket, which had slipped further, exposing a reddened scar. David waved him off, his breath still uneven, and adjusted the Purple Heart medal, tucking it back beneath his shirt. The Korean War veteran approached, his cane tapping rhythmically. "Staff Sergeant Frank Morales," he said, extending a gnarled hand. "You held your ground, son." David shook the hand, his grip firm despite the tremor. "Thank you for standing, sir." Morales nodded, his cap tilting slightly. "We take care of our own." Outside, news vans multiplied, their satellite dishes glinting through the rain. Reporters huddled under awnings, shouting into microphones as cameras panned the courthouse's stone facade. Inside, the postal worker approached David, her name tag reading Clara. "My boy served in Kandahar," she said, her voice thick. "This ain't right." David nodded, his eyes on the chamber doors. The stenographer packed her machine, her hands shaking as she glanced at the crowd. The bailiff stood by the exit, his radio crackling with static, his eyes darting to the clock. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, one bulb popping with a sharp snap, plunging half the room into shadow. A side door creaked open. A court clerk, her blouse damp from the storm, hurried to the bailiff, whispering urgently. His face tightened, and he strode to the chamber doors, knocking twice. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held as the doors swung wide. Brooks re-emerged, her robe disheveled, a folder of papers tucked under her arm. Ramirez followed, her expression unreadable, carrying a second photograph, one showing David in Iraq, standing beside a burning Humvee, dragging a soldier to safety. Brooks stopped at the bench, her gaze sweeping the room. The crowd rose again, unprompted, their shoes scuffing the floor. David straightened in his wheelchair, his scarred hand resting on the Purple Heart's cord. Lightning flashed, and the room braced for her next words. The storm's roar softened to a steady hiss, rain streaking the windows of Courtroom 7 in thin, relentless threads. Inside, Judge Elena Brooks stood at her bench, her black robe creased from the hurried chamber meeting. Her silver hair caught the dimming fluorescent glow, one bulb still dark from its earlier pop. A folder of papers lay splayed before her, the top sheet bearing a photograph. David Keene in Iraq, his face smudged with soot, dragging a soldier from a burning Humvee. Her fingers hovered over the image, then curled into a fist. David Keene, 34, sat upright in his wheelchair, the cuffs gone but red marks circling his wrists. His khaki pants, damp from the floor, clung to his prosthetic leg, the socket's edge digging into his scarred thigh. Sweat glistened on his weathered face, his left hand twitching as he adjusted the Purple Heart medal's cord at his neck. His attorney, Marcus Washington, stood beside him, his tie loosened, a notepad clutched in one hand. The splintered defense table bore a fresh crack from David's fall, its jagged edge catching the light. Colonel Jennifer Ramirez positioned herself near the bench, her army dress uniform crisp, her boots gleaming despite the courthouse's grime. The federal order and a second photograph, of David stranded at the inaccessible bus stop, rested on the bench, their corners curling in the humid air. Her insignia flashed as she shifted, her gaze steady on Brooks. The gallery remained on its feet, a silent wall of defiance. The Korean War veteran Frank Morales gripped his cane, his cap tilted forward. Clara, the postal worker, stood beside him, her name tag askew, her hands clasped tightly. Reporters' pens scratched, camera phones glinted, and a clerk's heels clicked as she slipped toward the exit, her face pale. Outside, news vans' lights pulsed through the rain, their red and blue beams fracturing across the wet glass. Brooks cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the hushed room. "This court reconvenes," she said, her voice steadier now but laced with strain. "Sergeant Keene, the charges of contempt stem from your repeated failure to appear. This court has reviewed the documentation provided by Colonel Ramirez." Her eyes flicked to the photographs, then back to David. "Explain your absences." "Now." David's wheelchair creaked as he leaned forward, his scarred hands gripping the armrests. "Your Honor, the downtown courthouse is 8 blocks from the nearest bus stop. No ramps, no sidewalks for a chair like mine." His voice was low, deliberate, each word punctuated by the rain's patter. "I requested video hearings or a transfer to West Side. The clerk denied both." A murmur swept the crowd. A reporter's camera clicked, the flash glinting off David's medal. Morales tapped his cane once, a sharp clack echoing. Clara whispered to a neighbor, her words lost in the buzz of a flickering light. Brooks raised a hand, silencing the gallery. "Mr. Keene, court schedules are not optional. You were notified of each hearing." Marcus stepped forward, his notepad trembling slightly. "Your Honor, the court's notices were sent to an outdated address. My client informed the clerk of his new residence and mobility issues. Those records were ignored." He pointed to the federal order. "The ADA requires accommodation. This courthouse failed to comply." Brooks' jaw tightened, her fingers brushing the photograph of David in Iraq. The room stilled, the rain's rhythm slowing to a drip. Ramirez spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. Your Honor, the Department of Veterans Affairs has documented 16 similar complaints in this jurisdiction. Disabled veterans denied access to justice. She slid another document across the bench, a list of names, dates, and inaccessible venues. The crowd stirred again. A veteran in a faded jacket stood taller, his dog tags clinking. A reporter whispered into a phone, her voice urgent. Brooks scanned the document, her lips pursing. The gavel lay untouched, its handle worn from years of verdicts. Colonel, this court will not be lectured on federal law, she said. But her tone wavered, her eyes darting to the standing gallery. David raised a hand, the tremor in his fingers visible. Your Honor, I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for a system that doesn't punish me for what I lost in service. His metal swung free, catching a beam of light. I dragged 2 men from that Humvee. I can't drag myself through a broken sidewalk in a storm. The gallery erupted. Gasps, shouts, Morales' cane slamming the floor. Hear him, he barked. Clara nodded, tears glinting on her cheeks. The bailiff stepped forward, his radio crackling, but Ramirez raised a hand, halting him. Brooks slammed her gavel, the crack splitting the chaos. Order! The lights flickered, plunging the room into shadow for a heartbeat before buzzing back. David's face remained steady, his eyes locked on Brooks. She leaned forward, her robe rustling, and pointed to the photograph of the bus stop. Mr. Keene, you claim this courthouse is inaccessible, yet you are here now. David's hand tightened on the Purple Heart cord. I paid a neighbor to drive me, cost me a week's groceries. His voice dropped, barely audible over the rain. Not every veteran has that option. A hush fell. A reporter's pen stopped mid-stroke, ink blotting her page. Morales leaned on his cane, his breath heavy. Clara reached into her pocket, pulling out a small photograph, a young man in army fatigues, smiling. She held it up, her hand trembling, and the crowd's eyes followed. Ramirez seized the moment, her boots clicking as she approached the bench. Your Honor, the VA requests a full accessibility audit of this courthouse, effective immediately. Federal funding depends on compliance. She placed a thick binder beside the photographs, its cover stamped with the VA seal. Brooks's face flushed, her fingers gripping the binder's edge. The gavel trembled in her other hand, as if itching to strike. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held, as the rain outside slowed to a drizzle, the room's silence now deafening. This court will not be strong-armed, Brooks said, her voice rising, but I will consider the evidence. The chamber doors creaked open. A man in a suit, his briefcase dripping from the storm, hurried to the bench, whispering to the clerk. Her eyes widened and she passed a note to Brooks. The judge read it, her expression shifting, jaw slackening, eyes narrowing. She folded the note, her hands unsteady, and addressed the room. This court is in recess for 1 hour. Counsel, my chambers. Brooks swept from the bench, the binder and photographs tucked under her arm. Ramirez followed, her stride unbroken. Marcus hesitated, then joined them, his notepad crumpled in his fist. The doors slammed shut, the sound swallowed by a fresh peal of thunder. The gallery remained standing, eyes on David. He adjusted his wheelchair, wincing as the prosthetic socket pinched. Morales approached, his cane tapping. You shook him, son, he said, clapping David's shoulder. Clara slipped the photograph back into her pocket, her fingers lingering on its edge. Outside, the drizzle thickened to rain again, news van's lights flashing brighter. A crowd gathered on the courthouse steps, umbrellas bobbing, signs scrawled with "Justice for Vets" catching the camera lenses. Inside, the bailiff's radio crackled with orders, his face tense. The clerk slipped back through the side door, carrying a stack of files stamped "Confidential." David's eyes drifted to the bench, where the gavel lay abandoned. The lights flickered once more, and a single sheet of paper, The federal order slipped from the folder, fluttering to the floor. Its corner landed in a puddle from the clerk's wet shoes, the ink beginning to bleed. Rain pelted the courthouse roof, a low rumble vibrating through Courtroom 7's oak-paneled walls. The fluorescent lights, one still dead, cast uneven shadows across the bench where Judge Elena Brooks had vanished into her chambers an hour ago. A single sheet of paper, the federal order, lay crumpled on the floor, its ink bleeding into a puddle from the clerk's sodden shoes. The gavel rested untouched, its handle worn smooth by years of judgments. David Keene, 34, shifted in his wheelchair, the military-grade frame creaking under his weight. His khaki pants, streaked with dust and damp, clung to his prosthetic leg, the socket's edge chafing a raw scar. His weathered face glistened with sweat, his left hand twitching as he tucked the Purple Heart medal beneath his shirt. Red marks from the cuffs lingered on his wrists, stark against his scarred skin. His attorney, Marcus Washington, paced nearby, his cheap suit jacket crumpled, a notepad stuffed into his pocket. The gallery buzzed with restless energy. Frank Morales, the Korean War veteran, leaned on his cane, his cap's 38th Infantry embroidery catching the dim light. Clara, the postal worker, stood rigid, her name tag glinting as she clutched a photograph of her son in army fatigues. Reporters scribbled, their pens scratching like insects, while camera phones flashed intermittently, reflecting off the rain-streaked windows. Outside, news vans' lights pulsed, their beams slicing through the storm's gray curtain. The chamber doors swung open. Brooks emerged, her black robe askew, a thick binder stamped with the VA seal tucked under her arm. Her silver hair, usually immaculate, hung loose, framing a face taut with strain. Colonel Jennifer Ramirez followed, her army dress uniform pristine, her boots clicking with measured precision. Marcus trailed behind, his notepad now clutched in both hands, pages creased. The crowd hushed, chairs creaking as some sat, others remaining upright. Brooks climbed the bench, her movements stiff. She set the binder down with a thud, the photographs of David, stranded at the bus stop and dragging a soldier from a burning Humvee, spilling across the wood. Her fingers brushed the federal order, now retrieved and smoothed flat. "This court resumes," she said, her voice low but sharp, cutting through the rain's drone. "Sergeant Keene, this court has reviewed the evidence of your absences." David straightened, his wheelchair's wheels squeaking against the tile. His scarred hands gripped the armrests, his eyes locking on Brooks. The crowd leaned forward, a reporter's pen hovering mid-air, ink dripping onto her sleeve. Morales tapped his cane once, the sound echoing like a warning shot. Brooks lifted the bus stop photograph, holding it aloft. "You claim this courthouse's inaccessibility prevented your attendance. The court acknowledges the documented challenges." Her gaze flicked to Ramirez, then back to David. "However, contempt requires accountability, regardless of circumstance." Marcus surged forward, his voice rising. "Your Honor, punishing my client for systemic failures violates federal law. The ADA mandates—" "Mr. Washington," Brooks interrupted, her gavel rising but not striking. "This court is aware of the statutes. Sit down." Marcus froze, then sank into his chair, his notepad slipping to the floor. The crowd murmured, Clara's photograph trembling in her hands. David raised a hand, his tremor visible. "Your Honor, I missed those hearings because the system failed me, not because I disrespected this court." His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I served to uphold justice. I'm asking for that same justice now." The Purple Heart medal slipped free again, glinting under the flickering lights. The gallery erupted. Shouts, gasps, Morales slamming his cane against the floor. "Give him a chance!" he barked. Clara held her son's photograph higher, tears streaking her face. A reporter's camera clicked, the flash illuminating David's scarred face. Ramirez stepped closer to the bench, her hand resting on the VA binder, her insignia catching the light. Brooks slammed her gavel, the crack splitting the chaos. "Order!" The lights flickered, plunging the room into shadow for a heartbeat. When they buzzed back, her face was flushed, her fingers gripping the photographs. "Sergeant Keene, your service is noted, but this court cannot excuse repeated absences without consequence." A side door burst open. A court clerk, her blouse soaked, stumbled in, clutching a manila envelope marked urgent. She hurried to the bench, whispering to Brooks. The judge's eyes widened as she tore the envelope open, pulling out a stack of letters. Dozens, handwritten, some smudged with rain. She skimmed the top one, her lips parting, then passed it to Ramirez. The colonel read silently, her jaw tightening, then handed it to Marcus. Marcus scanned the page, his hands shaking. "Your Honor, these are from veterans across the county. They describe identical access issues, courthouses, VA offices, public transit." He held up a letter, its ink blurred but legible. "This one's from a double amputee who missed a hearing because the elevator was broken. He was fined $500. The crowd roared, feet stomping, voices overlapping. Morales shouted, "Shame!" Clara waved her son's photograph, her sobs audible. Reporters scrambled, phones recording, pens flying. The bailiff moved toward the gallery, his radio crackling, but Ramirez raised a hand, stopping him. Brooks's gavel struck again, weaker this time, barely heard over the din. David's eyes never left Brooks. His scarred hand rested on the Purple Heart, his breath steady despite the chaos. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising above the noise. "Punish me if you must. But fix the system so no veteran faces this again." Brooks froze, the letters splayed before her. The photographs of David, stranded, heroic, seemed to pulse under the flickering lights. Rain hammered the windows, a fresh gust rattling the panes. The crowd quieted, eyes fixed on the judge. Ramirez leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Your Honor, the VA can assist with immediate reforms. But this court must act now." Brooks's fingers tightened on the gavel, her knuckles white. She glanced at the letters, then at David, her expression unreadable. The lights buzzed louder, one bulb sparking before going dark. "This court will adjourn for the day," she said, her voice almost lost in the rain's roar. "Proceedings resume tomorrow at 9. The gavel fell, its thud swallowed by thunder. Brooks gathered the letters and photographs, her hands trembling, and swept into her chambers. Ramirez followed, her boots echoing. Marcus knelt beside David, whispering, but David waved him off, his eyes on the chamber doors. The gallery remained standing, their silence heavier than the storm. Morales approached David, his cane tapping. "You lit a fire, son," he said, his voice thick. Clara slipped her son's photograph into David's hand, her fingers brushing his. "For him," she whispered, then stepped back. Outside, the crowd on the courthouse steps swelled, signs now sodden but raised high. "Access is justice. Honor our vets." News cameras panned the scene, their lights glaring through the rain. Inside, the bailiff locked the chamber doors, his face grim. David tucked Clara's photograph into his shirt beside the Purple Heart and wheeled toward the exit. As he reached the courthouse doors, they flew open. A young woman in a wheelchair, her army jacket patched with unit insignias, blocked his path. Her face, scarred like his, was set with determination. "Sergeant Keene," she said, her voice cutting through the rain's hiss, "you're not alone anymore." Behind her, a line of veterans, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, stretched into the storm, their silhouettes stark against the flashing news lights. The rain had eased to a fine mist, cloaking the Riverside County Courthouse in a gray haze. Sodium streetlights buzzed, casting orange pools across the wet steps where news vans idled, their cameras trained on a growing crowd of veterans. Signs, justice for all, access now, bobbed above umbrellas, smudged ink bleeding under the drizzle. Inside Courtroom 7, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp wood and lemon cleaner, the fluorescent lights flickering fitfully, two bulbs now dark. David Keene, 34, maneuvered his wheelchair through the courthouse's arched doorway, the military-grade frame rattling over the uneven threshold. His khaki pants, still damp from the day's chaos, clung to his prosthetic leg, the socket rubbing raw against his scarred thigh. His weathered face tightened as he adjusted the Purple Heart medal at his neck, Clara's photograph of her soldier son tucked beside it. His left hand trembled, fingers brushing the wheelchair's armrests, red cuff marks fading but visible. The young woman in the army jacket, her own wheelchair blocking the exit, rolled aside. Her face, scarred from shrapnel, bore a faint smile. "Sergeant Keene," she said again, her voice steady, "we're with you." Behind her, the line of veterans, wheelchairs, crutches, canes, stretched into the mist, their silhouettes sharp against the news van's flashing lights. A man with a prosthetic arm raised a fist, his dog tags glinting. A woman with a service dog leaned on her cane, her eyes fixed on David. Marcus Washington, 29, hurried to David's side, his suit jacket soaked, notepad bulging from his pocket. "We need to prep for tomorrow," he said, his voice low, glancing at the crowd. David nodded, his scarred hand tightening on the wheelchair's wheel, but his gaze lingered on the veterans. Reporters pushed closer, microphones thrusting forward, their questions overlapping in a chaotic hum. "Sergeant Keene, comment on the hearing? What's next for the VA?" David raised a hand, silencing them. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice cutting through the drizzle's hiss. "It's about every veteran who can't get to a courtroom, a hospital, a job." He gestured to the crowd behind him. "They're the story." Cameras swiveled, flashes popping as the veterans stood taller, their signs held high. The young woman in the army jacket wheeled forward, her insignia catching the light. "We're not invisible anymore," she said, her words sparking murmurs of agreement. Inside, the courtroom lay quiet, its oak panels absorbing the echo of the day's uproar. The bench stood empty, Judge Elena Brooks's gavel abandoned beside the VA binder and scattered photographs. David at the bus stop, David in Iraq. The federal order, its ink still smeared, curled at the edges. A janitor swept the floor, his broom scraping past the splintered defense table, the crack from David's fall stark under the dim lights. In Brooks' chambers, the judge sat at her desk, her robe draped over a chair. Her silver hair fell loose, her hands trembling as she sifted through the stack of veterans' letters. One described a paraplegic denied a teleconference hearing. Another, a blind veteran fined for missing a court date due to no accessible transit. A photograph slipped from the pile, David receiving his Purple Heart in a hospital bed, his leg gone, his eyes hollow but defiant. Brooks' fingers lingered on the image, her jaw tightening. Colonel Jennifer Ramirez stood by the window, her army dress uniform untouched by the day's strain. Her boots gleamed as she turned, placing a new document on the desk. A proposed court accessibility plan, stamped with the VA seal. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "these reforms can start tomorrow. Your court can lead the change." Brooks' eyes flicked to the document, then to the photograph, but she said nothing, her lips a thin line. Back at the courthouse steps, David wheeled through the crowd, veterans parting to let him pass. Frank Morales, the Korean War veteran, fell in step beside him, his cane tapping the wet stone. "You've started something big, son," he said, his cap dripping. Clara joined them, her postal uniform damp, her son's photograph now pinned to her chest like a medal. "My boy would have been proud," she said, her voice catching. A news van's spotlight swept over them, illuminating David's scarred face. He paused, his wheelchair creaking, and faced the cameras. "Fix the ramps, the buses, the rules," he said, his words deliberate.
That's how you honor service." The crowd roared, fists raised, signs waving. The young woman in the army jacket wheeled closer, her voice rising. "We're not asking for favors. We're demanding what's ours." Marcus tugged David's sleeve, nodding toward a side alley where a neighbor's battered van waited, its engine idling. "We need to go." "Reporters won't stop." David nodded, but his eyes scanned the veterans. Dozens now, their faces a mix of resolve and exhaustion. He wheeled toward the van, the crowd's cheers following him, their voices drowning the drizzle's patter. Inside Brooks' chambers, a knock broke the silence. The clerk entered, her blouse still damp, carrying a tablet. "Your Honor, it's trending online," she said, swiping to a video feed. The screen showed David on the steps, his words, "Fix the ramps," looping on social media, shared thousands of times. Hashtags flashed. Had justice for vets, had access now. Brooks watched, her face unreadable, as the clerk added, "National news is picking it up." Ramirez stepped forward, her insignia glinting. "Your Honor, the public is watching. Your ruling tomorrow will set a precedent." Brooks set the tablet down, her fingers brushing the Purple Heart photograph. She stood, her movements slow, and retrieved her robe, slipping it on. "We reconvene at 9, she said, her voice flat, and dismissed them with a nod. Outside, David climbed into the van, his prosthetic leg awkward as he shifted from the wheelchair. Marcus folded the chair, stowing it in the back, while the driver, a grizzled man in a flannel shirt, glanced at the crowd. "You're famous now," he said, half smiling. David shook his head, his scarred hand resting on Clara's photograph. "I just want a courthouse I can enter without a fight." As the van pulled away, the crowd's chants faded, but their signs glowed under the streetlights. News cameras lingered, panning to the young woman in the army jacket, who now held a megaphone. "We're not done!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the courthouse walls. Veterans cheered, their silhouettes merging with the mist. Inside Courtroom 7, the janitor paused, his broom still. He picked up the federal order from the floor, smoothing its smeared ink, and placed it on the bench beside the gavel. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the photographs, David's past and present, a silent challenge to the empty room. At the courthouse's rear entrance, a side door creaked open. A figure emerged, hooded against the drizzle, carrying a small box. The figure slipped into an unmarked car, the box, stamped Court Records, tucked under their arm. The car's taillights flared, disappearing into the mist as a new gust of rain swept the steps, washing away the last traces of the day's ink-smeared signs. The mist thickened into a steady drizzle, cloaking the Riverside County Courthouse in a shimmering veil. Streetlights flickered, their orange glow fracturing across puddles that mirrored the neon flash of news vans parked along the curb. Inside Courtroom 7, the air clung damp and heavy, the scent of wet oak mingling with the faint tang of ink from the federal order resting on Judge Elena Brooks's bench. The fluorescent lights buzzed, 3 bulbs now dark, casting the room in a patchwork of shadow and glare. David Keene, 34, wheeled through the courthouse's rear entrance, his military-grade wheelchair rattling over a cracked ramp. His khaki pants, creased and still damp, stretched tight over his prosthetic leg, the socket's edge biting into his scarred thigh. His weathered face tightened as he adjusted the Purple Heart medal at his neck, Clara's photograph of her soldier son pinned beside it. His left hand trembled, fingers brushing the armrests, the red cuff marks now faint but visible. Marcus Washington followed, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, a stack of legal papers tucked under his arm. The courtroom lay quiet, its oak panels absorbing the echo of yesterday's uproar. The splintered defense table stood untouched, its crack a jagged scar under the dim light. The bench held the VA binder, its pages splayed, and 2 photographs, David stranded at the bus stop,
David in Iraq beside a burning Humvee. The gavel rested beside them, its handle glinting faintly. A janitor mopped the floor, his bucket's wheels squeaking, pausing to nudge the federal order back onto the bench. Outside, the crowd of veterans swelled, their signs, "Access is justice, honor our vets," sodden but raised high. The young woman in the army jacket, her wheelchair adorned with unit patches, led the chant, her megaphone's blare cutting through the drizzle. "No more barriers!" she shouted, her scarred face lit by camera flashes. A man with a prosthetic arm held a sign aloft, his dog tag swinging. A woman with a service dog gripped her cane, her eyes scanning the courthouse doors. David paused at the courtroom's threshold, his wheelchair creaking. Marcus leaned in, his voice low. "Brooks is under pressure. That box of records disappearing last night. It's got the clerk's office spooked." David nodded, his scarred hand tightening on the Purple Heart cord, but his gaze drifted to the gallery, where early arrivals filtered in. Frank Morales, the Korean War veteran, shuffled to a seat, his cane tapping, his cap's 38th Infantry embroidery catching the light. Clara followed, her postal uniform crisp, her son's photograph now framed in a small pin on her chest. The chamber doors swung open. Brooks emerged, her black robe pristine but her silver hair slightly disheveled. Her hands clutched a new folder, its cover unmarked, and her eyes darted to the empty spot where the court records box had been. Colonel Jennifer Ramirez followed, her army dress uniform immaculate, her boots clicking with precision. Her insignia gleamed as she carried a sealed envelope, its VA stamp stark against the white paper. Marcus hurried to the defense table, spreading his papers, his pen skittering across the wood. Brooks climbed the bench, her movements deliberate. She set the folder down, its thud echoing in the hushed room. "This court reconvenes," she said, her voice steady but strained, the drizzle's hiss audible through the windows. "Sergeant Keene, this court has reviewed the veterans' letters and the VA's accessibility complaints." Her gaze flicked to the photographs, then to David. "The contempt charges remain under consideration." David straightened, his wheelchair's wheels squeaking. His scarred hands gripped the armrests, his eyes locked on Brooks. The gallery filled, reporters, veterans, clerks, their shoes scuffing the floor. Morales leaned forward, his cane propped against his knee. Clara adjusted her son's photograph pin, her fingers trembling. Camera phones flashed, their bursts glinting off the bench's polished wood. Marcus stood, his voice rising. "Your Honor, the missing court records, those were evidence of systemic failures. Their disappearance suggests interference." He pointed to the VA binder. "The veterans' letters prove this isn't just about my client. It's about a broken system." Brooks's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing the unmarked folder. "Mr. Washington, speculation about missing records is irrelevant. This court focuses on the case at hand." Her eyes narrowed, but her hand hesitated over the gavel, as if reluctant to strike. Ramirez stepped forward, her boots clicking. "Your Honor, the VA has recovered partial records from a digital backup." She slid the sealed envelope across the bench, its wax stamp cracking under Brooks's gaze. "They detail 16 denied accommodation requests in this courthouse alone, including Sergeant Keene's." The crowd murmured, a reporter's pen scratching furiously, ink smearing her sleeve. David raised a hand, his tremor visible. "Your Honor, I'm not here to fight this court. I'm here to fix what's wrong." His voice was low, deliberate, each word punctuated by the drizzle's patter. "Veterans shouldn't need to beg for access to justice." The Purple Heart medal swung free, catching a beam of light. The gallery erupted, shouts, gasps, Morales slamming his cane against the floor. "Listen to him!" he barked. Clara held her son's photograph pin higher, tears glinting. A reporter's camera clicked, the flash illuminating David's scarred face. Ramirez raised a hand, silencing the crowd, her insignia gleaming.
Brooks slammed her gavel, the crack splitting the chaos. "Order!" The lights flickered, one bulb sparking before stabilizing. Her face flushed, her fingers gripping the envelope. "Sergeant Keene, your passion is noted, but this court cannot rewrite federal law based on sentiment." A side door creaked open. The clerk, her blouse dry but her face pale, hurried to the bench, whispering urgently. Brooks's eyes widened as she accepted a single sheet of paper, its edges torn, stamped confidential. She read it, her lips parting, then passed it to Ramirez. The colonel's jaw tightened as she scanned the text, then handed it to Marcus. Marcus read aloud, his voice trembling. "This is a memo from the clerk's office, dated last year. It instructs staff to deny all accommodation requests without review, citing budget constraints." The crowd roared, feet stomping, voices overlapping. Morales shouted, "Cover up!" Clara waved her son's photograph, her sobs audible. Reporters scrambled, phones recording, pens flying. Brooks's gavel struck again, weaker, barely audible over the din. "Order!" Her voice cracked, her hands shaking as she clutched the memo. The drizzle outside intensified, rain hammering the windows. Ramirez leaned forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Your Honor, this memo violates federal law. The VA demands an immediate investigation." David's eyes never left Brooks. His scarred hand rested on Clara's photograph, his breath steady. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising above the chaos, "that memo isn't just paper. It's every veteran turned away, fined, humiliated. Fix it." The gallery stilled, eyes fixed on Brooks. Her fingers tightened on the gavel, her knuckles white. The lights buzzed louder, casting jagged shadows across the photographs. David's struggle, his heroism. "This court will recess for 30 minutes, she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Counsel, my chambers." Brooks swept from the bench, the memo and photographs clutched in her hands. Ramirez followed, her boots echoing. Marcus gathered his papers, his hands shaking, and joined them. The doors slammed shut, the sound swallowed by a fresh gust of rain. The gallery remained standing, their silence heavy. Morales approached David, his cane tapping. "You're peeling back the rot, son," he said, his voice thick. Clara adjusted her son's photograph pin, her fingers brushing David's arm. "You're fighting for all of us," she whispered. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder, the young woman in the army jacket's megaphone blaring. "No more excuses!" Veterans raised their signs, their silhouettes stark against the news van's lights. Inside, the janitor paused, his mop still, and picked up the torn memo's corner from the floor, tucking it into his pocket. As David wheeled toward the exit, the courtroom doors burst open. A television crew, their camera emblazoned with a national news logo, stormed in, the reporter shouting, "Sergeant Keene, your story's gone viral!" The camera's spotlight hit David, illuminating his scarred face and the Purple Heart medal, as the crowd's cheers outside shook the rain-soaked windows. Rain streaked the Riverside County Courthouse windows, the drizzle now a faint whisper against the glass. Inside Courtroom 7, the air clung thick with the scent of damp oak and ink, the fluorescent lights flickering, 4 bulbs now dark, casting the room in a dim, uneven glow. The bench stood cluttered with the VA binder, photographs of David Keene, stranded at a bus stop, dragging a soldier from a burning Humvee, and a torn memo stamped "Confidential," its ink smeared but legible. The gavel lay tilted, its handle catching a stray beam of light. David Keene, 34, sat rigid in his military-grade wheelchair, its wheels streaked with mud from the courthouse ramp. His khaki pants, creased and damp, stretched over his prosthetic leg, the socket's edge raw against his scarred thigh. His weathered face glistened faintly, his left hand trembling as he adjusted the Purple Heart medal at his neck, Clara's photograph of her soldier son pinned beside it.
Red cuff marks had faded to faint lines on his wrists. Marcus Washington stood at the defense table, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, legal papers scattered across the splintered wood. The gallery buzzed with tension, packed with veterans, reporters, and clerks. Frank Morales, the Korean War veteran, gripped his cane, his 38th Infantry cap tilted forward. Clara, in her postal uniform, clutched her son's photograph pin, her eyes red but steady. The young woman in the army jacket, her wheelchair adorned with unit patches, sat near the front, her scarred face set with resolve. Camera crews from national news outlets lined the walls, their spotlights glaring, cables snaking across the floor. Outside, the crowd's chants, "Access now," rumbled through the walls, signs glowing under news vans' lights. The chamber doors swung open. Judge Elena Brooks emerged, her black robe pristine but her silver hair loose, framing a face etched with fatigue. Her hands clutched a new stack of documents, the VA's accessibility plan on top. Colonel Jennifer Ramirez followed, her army dress uniform crisp, her boots clicking with precision, an embossed folder tucked under her arm. Marcus straightened, his pen poised over a crumpled notepad. David's wheelchair creaked as he faced the bench, his scarred hands steady on the armrests. Brooks climbed the bench, her movements slow. She set the documents down, the thud echoing in the hushed room. "This court reconvenes," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the faint drizzle's patter. "Sergeant Keene, this court has reviewed the memo, the veterans' letters, and the VA's evidence of systemic access failures." Her gaze swept the gallery, lingering on the camera crews, then settled on David. "The contempt charges are under final consideration." The crowd stirred, shoes scuffing, murmurs rising. Morales leaned forward, his cane tapping once. Clara adjusted her son's photograph pin, her fingers trembling. The young woman in the army jacket raised a hand, her insignia glinting, silencing the gallery. Reporters' pens scratched, camera shutters clicked, their flashes glinting off the bench's polished wood. Marcus stepped forward, his voice firm. "Your Honor, the memo proves deliberate denial of accommodations. My client's absences were caused by this court's failures, not defiance. Dismiss the charges and order reforms." He pointed to the VA binder, its pages splayed. "The evidence is undeniable." Brooks' fingers brushed the memo, her eyes flicking to the photographs. "Mr. Washington, this court does not act on ultimatums, but the evidence has been duly noted." Her voice wavered, her hand hesitating over the gavel. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the bench. Ramirez advanced, her boots clicking. "Your Honor, the VA has drafted an immediate action plan. Ramps, teleconferencing, staff training. This court can implement it today." She opened her folder, sliding a single sheet across the bench. A signed directive from the VA, its seal stark. "The nation is watching," the gallery murmured, a reporter's camera zooming in, its lens glinting. Morales nodded, his cane propped against his knee. Clara held her son's photograph pin higher, tears glinting. David raised a hand, his tremor faint but visible. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, rising above the crowd's hum. "I don't want an apology. I want a courthouse every veteran can enter without a fight." The Purple Heart medal swung free, catching the light. The crowd erupted, shouts, cheers, Morales slamming his cane against the floor. "That's it!" he barked. The young woman in the army jacket wheeled forward, her voice ringing. "No more excuses!" Camera crews surged, their spotlights blinding, cables tangling. Brooks slammed her gavel, the crack sharp but drowned by the chaos. "Order!" The lights buzzed, one bulb popping, plunging half the room into shadow. Brooks's face flushed, her hands gripping the directive. "Sergeant Keene, this court respects your service, but justice requires accountability." Her voice trembled, her eyes darting to the gallery, where veterans stood, fists raised. A side door burst open. The clerk, her face ashen, rushed to the bench, clutching a tablet. "Your Honor, it's gone national," she whispered, swiping to a live feed. The screen showed David's words, "Fix the ramps," playing on every major network, #, justice for vets, trending globally. Protests flared outside courthouses nationwide, veterans chanting in the rain. Brooks watched, her lips parting, then set the tablet down, her hands unsteady. Ramirez leaned forward, her voice low. "Your Honor, dismiss the charges. Lead the change, or the VA will escalate to federal oversight." Her insignia gleamed, her folder snapping shut. The crowd hushed, eyes fixed on Brooks. The drizzle outside slowed, the room's silence deafening. David's scarred hand rested on Clara's photograph, his breath even. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Punish me if you must, but make this right for them." He gestured to the gallery. Morales, Clara, the young woman in the army jacket, the veterans beyond the walls. Brooks's fingers tightened on the gavel, her knuckles white. She glanced at the photographs, the memo, the VA directive. The lights stabilized, casting her face in stark relief. "Sergeant Keene," she said, her voice softer now. "This court has erred." A gasp rippled through the gallery. "The contempt charges are dismissed." The crowd roared, feet stomping, cameras flashing. Morales raised his cane, shouting, "Justice!" Clara sobbed, clutching her son's photograph. The young woman in the army jacket wheeled forward, her fist raised. Brooks raised a hand, silencing the room. "Furthermore," she continued, "this court orders an immediate accessibility audit to be completed within 30 days. Teleconferencing and ramp installations begin tomorrow." The gavel fell, its thud swallowed by cheers. Brooks gathered the documents, her hands steady now, and stepped down from the bench. Ramirez nodded, her boots clicking as she approached David. "You've changed the system," she said, her voice low. David shook his head, his scarred hand brushing Clara's photograph. "They did," he said, nodding to the gallery. Outside, the crowd's chants shook the courthouse steps, signs waving under clearing skies. News cameras panned the scene, capturing the young woman in the army jacket leading the veterans, her megaphone blaring. "We won today, but we keep fighting." Inside, Morales approached David, his cane tapping. "You're a hell of a soldier, son," he said, clapping his shoulder. Clara handed David her son's photograph, her voice thick. "Keep it. He'd want you to." David nodded, pinning it beside his Purple Heart. As David wheeled toward the exit, the camera crews followed, their spotlights illuminating his scarred face. Reporters shouted questions, but he raised a hand, silencing them. "Build the ramps," he said, his voice steady. "That's the story." The courthouse doors opened, revealing a sea of veterans, their signs glowing under the streetlights. The young woman in the army jacket wheeled beside David, her scarred face lit with resolve. "We're just getting started," she said, her words echoing as the crowd parted, their cheers carrying into the night.